Good afternoon, officially now, everyone. Sandra Vesey Einhorn, Executive Director here at the Coordinating Council of Broward. Before we begin, I want to give my thank yous. I certainly want to thank Yana from the CCB for literally everything. I'd like to thank our partners at Wells Fargo and PNC Bank for providing funding for our webinar series, to Harrison Grant Williams, Chief of Staff for Senator Nan Rich, who is unable to join us today as she has a conflict with the Homeless Continuum of Care Board meeting, and certainly to our three subject matter experts. Today, we are joined by Charlotte Mather Taylor, the President and CEO of the Area Agency on Aging in Broward County, Dr. Linda Parker, the President and CEO of Women in Distress, and Pat Murphy, the President and CEO of the Ann Stork Center. I'm going to provide each of them an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves and their organizations, and then we are going to get into a wonderful panel discussion on housing for special populations, followed by, at the very end, we'll allow time for some questions if folks from the audience want to ask anything. But this is really meant to be conversational between me and the panelists. And really, today's webinar is designed to help folks understand what happens when we're talking about the housing affordability crisis and we're not strictly focused on the workforce. How do we provide, and what are the challenges for some of the special populations that might work part-time but might not be able to be reflected in the workforce full-time? So, Charlotte, if you'd like to start by introducing yourself and your organization.
Yes, happy to. Hi, I'm Charlotte Mather Taylor. I'm the CEO for the Area Agency on Aging of Broward County. We serve older adults 60 and above, and also individuals with disabilities or going through the long-term care Medicaid screening process. We are connected to other area agencies on aging in the state of Florida, so we are a network, which is wonderful because we're a coordinated system of care. One of the things that I really want to mention is that housing is a major concern of individuals that are calling our program for help. For example, in 2022, we received only 2,900 calls asking about housing. In 23, we received 3,433. Then it increased to 2024 to 5,990. And in 2025, this year, we had 7,629 calls of people asking for housing assistance. So you can see the importance of this program that Sandra has organized. We provide a variety of different services. Many of them can help with housing insecurity. We actually own housing, and we also will provide different services such as emergency energy assistance, helping with FPL bills, home repairs to assist you with modifications to make your home safe. We also have navigators, housing navigators that will help you to look for assistance and help if you're looking for a new home. We have on contract with us, one of our providers is Coast to Coast Legal Aid that provides housing assistance for those who need legal assistance regarding housing concerns. And then we have a lot of other supportive services that can assist individuals, such as home delivered meals, congregate meals, a meal box program. We have a program where we have an intergenerational program where older adults can work with college students and have some companionship. We have a variety of different in-home services to help people when they're needing assistance in the home. And that can also be a real issue when people are aging in place and suddenly it's hard for them to manage their homes. Even we provide assistance with cleaning, people checking on people medically. We also have senior centers, daycare centers located throughout the community. And we have a very robust program of navigators that will work with families to help them navigate the system in looking for resources to help them, as well as a program called T-Care, where we'll assist people to look at their caregiver situation, assess caregiver burnout, and provide the resources they need. We have a lot of other different services, so I don't want to take up too much time. So I'll just mention a couple others that I think are critical. We provide a lot of different technology to help people with fall prevention and also socialization. I think that's also very important when we're talking about housing. And we also have a grandparent program that can assist grandparents who are taking care of a young one that they didn't expect to be taken care of. So again, that doesn't list all of our services, but it's quite a few of them. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to take up the whole session. If you're interested, we have our website. You can actually see it behind my screen. You can go on there and check out for additional services. So that's it for now, and I look forward to speaking further. Thank you.
Great. Charlotte, thank you so much. And now we are going to move on to Dr. Linda Parker from Women in Distress. Good afternoon, Linda.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, I am, as Sandra said, Dr. Linda Parker, and I am the president and CEO of Women in Distress. Women in Distress is Broward County's certified domestic violence center. We're a full service agency. We have a 156 bed shelter. We have outreach services. We have a pet shelter. We have a law firm connected to us that works on injunctions for protection and dependency. And we do have a full housing department. Our housing, we just purchased our first property for transitional housing, and we are in contract for our second, which should be completed right around the end of January. So with both of those properties, we'll be able to house both individuals and large families. So we can transition them easier back into being independent and, working through some of the trauma that comes from being a domestic abuse survivor. I'll talk a little bit more about later as we get through this meeting about the kind of the pinpoints for domestic abuse survivors. It's kind of unique to be housing them. There's a lot of concerns that maybe others may not have to worry about when it comes to just looking up and trying to find a place to live. So, we have a lot of programs here at Women in Distress. Aside from what we do here in Broward County, we are also the contract holder for the state of Florida. So we answer the statewide hotline, as well as work with two other providers on training and technical assistance for the state of Florida as it relates to all things domestic violence. And then the Legal Protection Project, which houses and oversees all of the injunction for protection attorneys in Florida, as well as the legal hotline. So we receive about 30,000 calls into Women in Distress every year between Broward County, we take about 17,000 calls a year into Broward County for domestic abuse survivors, and about another 13,000 for the state of Florida. And to kind of put that in perspective, the national network that answers the national hotline takes less calls than Broward County receives in a given year. So just from a perspective standpoint, that kind of gives you the idea of the need of domestic violence and services in Broward County, unfortunately. So I look forward to the conversation.
Wow, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, good afternoon, Pat.
Hello, and thank you, Sandra. And really thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important conversation. I'm very excited and look forward to diving in. The N-Stork Center has been around, believe it or not, for over 70 years. We started in the early 50s when a pediatric nurse joined South Florida and saw a need for children with disabilities. And since then, we have now have 14 programs over 11 locations, and we support people from birth all the way through the end of life. And really, the mission throughout our programs are to discover abilities and build independence, so people in general can live happier, independent, and more fulfilling lives. We have an early intervention program that one of the few in the county that starts at birth and goes now through seventh grade. And that has a variety of education and innovative therapy as part of that. We also have 10 residential programs. So we have four that are integrated through the community and six that support some of the most medically challenged folks in our state. We also really expanded our kids programs as well. We have a STEP program, which is supported training and employment. We're in 4 high schools. We have a family strengthening program, which helps families with abuse and neglect. Individuals that have developmental disabilities are 5 times more likely to have a neglectful or abusive situation in their families. So we support the families in that regard. We have respite, we have advocacy, and we have an exciting thing that's happening. We have a corporation. I'm not allowed to say who it is right now, but it's a corporate organization in the community that is merging with us. And they are an agency that provides supported living and supported employment and day programs to our community. So I have a lot of experience in the supported living in area as far as folks with developmental disabilities, and we're excited to bring this group aboard and provide them those services as well.
Great, Pat. Thank you so much for that. Pat, I'm actually going to ask you the first question, but it's a question that I'm going to ask Linda and Charlotte as well. It's probably the most basic question. What's the biggest gap between what people with disabilities need and what's available for housing? And so similar, Charlotte, what's the biggest difference between what the needs are of the population that you serve and what's available? And we'll start with you, Pat.
Sure, and that the housing crisis in the U.S. is certainly broad, but the impact especially acute for those with special needs. Um, right off the bat, the limited affordable housing is right there, and it's not simply there aren't enough affordable units, but those that are exist, aren't currently accessible or lack supportive features. It's surprising to find out that less than 10% of existing affordable units have full accessibility features. It's a requirement, obviously, by the federal law, but roll-in showers, grab bars, lower thresholds. Despite the legal requirements, as I noted, for accessibility in new federally assisted housing, it's not always there. So it's certainly an issue. And again, for the disability world, it's not just again, a house and 4 walls is important for people, but in this regard, accessibility is from their environment is important, but then also accessibility to the community from there. Transportation, a lot of people with developmental disabilities don't have, they need to use public transportation. So they need to be situated in an area that they can access them. Another gap is certainly the rising costs. Hopefully we think they are and then they aren't, but the rapid rent increases. Many of our population live on their Social Security and their Social Security disability, making it really impossible to compete in the current rental market. The gaps also in the continuum of care, as far as it's like I said, it's more than the 4 walls. It's connecting into our care system. The health, the mental health, employment, transportation. There's certainly a fragmentation between the systems that are creating this instability and this gap for the people with developmental disabilities. I could go on, Sandra, but I'll take a breath right now.
Charlotte and Linda, if you wanna chime in on what the difference is between what the needs are for your population and what's currently available. Charlotte, go ahead.
I can go next. Pat, I could basically repeat everything Pat said and then I'll add a few things. But one of the things about our senior population is as they age, they need more support oftentimes in their homes. So, our goal again is to help people to age in place. So I'm going back to, I want people to go to our website and look at our resources because we provide a lot of the resources. Pat mentioned grab bars. Those are critical for people. Enhanced lighting is key. As you age, you can't see as well and you can't get around the house as well. That will lead you more to falling, trip hazards, those types of things. Just all those types of accommodations, even if someone's health diminishes and they end up having to be in a wheelchair or using walkers. Sometimes they can't even get out of their house very well. So just putting in ramps and those types of things. So all of those home modifications are really, really important. The problem is the cost of living in Broward County has just gotten so much harder for people that people cannot oftentimes afford these modifications, or if they're living in a rental unit, maybe the landlord won't allow them. So these are all challenges. I do want to mention, because I think it's really important, the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. I know, Sandra, you're the expert on housing, so you would know them. They did a study on the high cost burden in Broward County. It was 17% for owner occupied seniors, living 80,276 seniors living in owner occupied homes, and then 85,273 seniors who are renters. And so in total, that's 165,000 seniors who have a high cost burden already. And so think about, as things get worse, they are being squeezed tightly. And so that's why we're getting more and more calls from people who are facing homelessness and really afraid of eviction. I had a very sad call from a 90-year-old who was living in their car. They had been in their apartment their whole time, and their landlord decided to increase their rent. I mean, that's just unconscionable. So these are the types of things that our senior population is facing. They're on fixed incomes, so they don't have that extra money as all of these increases are occurring. And then again, they have more support that they need. It's extremely important that they have those supportive things in place to be able to maintain their homes. So that's why I support things like accessible dwelling units, because you have a small home and you have a family on the same property, or communities where they're walkable communities, I think are helpful. Again, transportation is a big issue as well. Access to transportation, and a lot of seniors need door-to-door transportation, right? I think the top system, we all have our challenges with the top system, but it does overall in Broward County, we have a much better transportation system than in other areas. So thank God we have that. But again, there's just challenges that people face when they get older that someone younger doesn't think about. So all of those things, having things in close proximity, having the support. And the good news is I have to call her out, through the leadership of Commissioner Nan Rich. We have more affordable units being built here in Broward County than most any place I know. And so all of those affordable units that are focused on senior housing and our other vulnerable populations, I think are going to really help as well. So again, just adding to what Pat said, there's clearly similar issues that we're facing with our senior population, individuals with disabilities.
Thank you. Linda, same question for you.
So, we have some of the same accessibility issues. I think a little bit unique to domestic violence and sexual violence and human trafficking victims is the safety concern. So it's not a matter of just placing a survivor where it would be the cheapest or the easiest, because if there's a safety concern with them living in a certain area, we have to worry about exposure, their ability to stay away from the abuser, right? The abuser getting access to them. So there are certain areas where, as a zip code, if they came from one zip code, we would try not to put them in that same zip code so that we don't have to worry about that piece of it. Additionally, our survivors financial abuse often runs hand in hand with other types of abuse. So by the time survivors actually decide to escape a domestic abuse situation, they often come to us without any income. Some of them haven't worked in many years because they weren't allowed to. There's oftentimes, reproductive abuse is very rampant in domestic violence relationships. So often survivors will either stay pregnant, because that's the only time that they won't get abused, or it's a form of coercion for him to continue to keep her pregnant. So often very young abuse victims may have anywhere between 4 to 7 kids. The cost of daycare is very high. So, and then when you've never worked, or you've had limited exposure to careers, your first career out of the gate is not going to be something that's going to pay Broward County prices. So you've got a large amount of children, or you don't have any income, and then you're expected to pay $2,200 to $3,500 a month in rent. Oftentimes, domestic abuse victims have evictions because the abuser has kept them from financials or have moved them around a lot in order to, as soon as someone draws attention to the fact that they're being abused, they have to leave. So they will have an eviction on their record. In Broward County, if you can't get that eviction and there's money owed on the account, then it's very difficult for you to be able to get into housing. Many survivors don't have vehicles, so we've got to be close to transportation, public transportation. You've got to be able to maneuver around the city. We've got to make sure that they have security, right? So security cameras, those types of things, Ring doorbell cameras, all of those things come into play when we try to house a survivor. Those unique pieces make it very complicated for our staff to work through where to place someone that meets all of the many criteria as it relates to, safety, security, financial, children. Best case is that they're near a school. Best case is that they're near somewhere safe. Best case is that they can afford the place they live in without living in what, would be considered not standard housing, or, housing where you're putting kids, all, 5 kids crammed into a bedroom. So, those are some of the concerns that we have and some of the challenges that we have that are very unique to our population.
Yeah, Linda, I'm actually going to stick with you. If you could just elaborate on that a little bit, and I do want to hear from Charlotte and from Pat, because I think that it's relevant for all of you. What housing models do you think work well for your specific population, and what does it take to be successful? And I think for all three of you, I'm going to ask that same question because they're all sort of different housing models. But what are some innovative housing models that you've seen to support your population, and what does it take for that to be successful?
So one of the things we know is that the model of the domestic violence model has traditionally been shelter for 6 weeks, emergency shelter 6 weeks, then you're supposed to figure it out, right? Well, we know that it takes you 2 weeks just to pick your head up in the shelter and realize that you're in a domestic violence shelter, right? The trauma that you've experienced is so profound that there's no way you're going to be ready to leave, right? So that model doesn't work. But what does work is when you get folks set up in the emergency shelter, you prepare them for the next step. And for us, that's transitional housing. The transitional housing is not quite as intensive as permanent supportive housing, right? Where you've got, a permanent system in place. This is a temporary holdover for us as a step down process. So we initially pay 100% of your rent for the first quarter, right? And then we step you down. And while that's happening, we're also meeting with you regularly to talk about your goals, help you set up with next steps, make sure that you're saving money, make sure that you have every single solitary resource that we can throw at you to try to shore you up. And then it steps down for a year to 18 months. And then at that time, you should be ready and have the acumen financially and emotionally to then be ready to transition, because it takes a very long time psychologically to unwind the domestic violence experience. And so during that time when you're in transitional housing, we get that opportunity. You get to go to group, you go to therapy, we talk to you about, some of the ways in which you can build yourself upon a foundation of success and basically restart your life, because that's what happens after you leave a domestic violence relationship. You're restarting a whole life, and rebuilding what you either had before or have never been able to have. So for us, it's transitional housing.
Great, thank you. Charlotte, what innovative housing models have you seen for seniors, and what does it take to make that successful?
Depending on the senior and where they're at in their life, and I do want to mention, I think it's very important to pay attention to yourself, or if you have a loved one, to watch where they're at. Because I find with our services, sometimes people wait too long. Someone's aging in their apartment and suddenly they can't handle the living situation they're in. So for example, permanent supportive housing, I really like that model for those who need some more case management and support. That's a really good model for those who are aging and need that little extra help. I also like independent living communities that are like 55 and above, because oftentimes they have social activities and different programs that are helpful to people, especially those who are living alone and might otherwise try to isolate in their apartments. There's some mixed use developments. I think like there was one built, like, for example, near Flagler Village, mixture of actually older and young in different age groups. I think that's very healthy for people because it gives that socialization and it keeps people vibrant. So I think that's helpful. I mentioned earlier, I like ADUs as well because I think it gives people the opportunity to be close to family members nearby, or even if it's not a family member, someone who's invested in who they are, so they have that support near them. And also just senior apartment complexes, like they just built the one down in Pembroke Park. I mentioned earlier, those are really helpful too. What's really important is location. All of us have mentioned transportation. It's such a critical thing because if you can't get to your appointments and you can't get out and socialize, go to the grocery store, all those things, that's a big issue. So access to transportation, access to social activities, those things are all really important. Any of those models, locations that support that type of interaction is, to me, really good for seniors.
Great. And Pat, how about you?
Yes. Yes, that's great, Charlotte. And really, I've seen the independent living really successful for people, and they can really transition if they can afford that environment. It seems like a nice ability to transition. In the world of developmental disability, certainly integrating housing and the services together are the challenge, but it's the model that works. Um, that could be supportive apartments, supported living, subsidized housing with some wraparound services. It could be personal care, it could be health, it could be recreational, the mixed income, those developments that embed services and partnerships are also, I think, very valuable. Um, I think the models for people in general, but also specifically with developmental disabilities, succeed when individuals control as much as they can and control their housing. Supports are customized, but adjustable. Um, and of course, the reliability of funding is always a challenge, but we've seen huge success in supported living environments. You have folks that may need an hour a week to 6 hours a week. So a variety of supports are certainly needed. The strong partnerships that exist, as you mentioned, Charlotte, and you did, Linda, with transportation, the healthcare, employment, and the accessibility of all those. What I really find, the success depends less really on the building that we're in. I guess, yes, the physical place that they're in is important as far as accessibility, but really the infrastructure of the supports around the person are vital.
Can I add one other thing?
Yes, please.
Um, Linda talked about safety. I think that's also important for seniors as well, being in a safe environment and in a structure that's safe and around people that are safe. So I
And
think,
disabilities,
and
right? Yeah.
disabilities as well, because I was thinking of that when you were talking. So I think that would also apply to all of our populations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Charlotte,
It-
Charlotte referencing back to a situation in a local municipality and at an elderly development, that safety conversation
I was thinking
is
about that.
is certainly very real. And we just talked, Pat just mentioned it, but Charlotte, I'm going to start with you, and then I really want to hear from the others as well. But what does it look like to have housing and supportive services work together, and how does that change with a person as they age? I'll just quickly mention in my Rebuilding Together time, I used to work with the occupational therapists. They have a specialty called aging in place. It's CAPS,
Mhm.
Certified Aging in Place Specialists.
Yes.
And I was really impressed to learn the depth and breadth of thoughtfulness on what it looks like to age in place. So if you could talk a little bit about how housing and supportive services work together, how that changes with a person as they age, and then certainly want to hear that both from the perspective of Pat and then Linda as well, because your supportive services look very different than the supportive services that Pat and Charlotte's population look at. Charlotte, go ahead.
So that's really basically one of the missions of our agency, right? To help people age in place and provide those supportive services to them. So again, as people move along, that may mean giving them a home delivered meal, which you wouldn't think of maybe in the context of what we're talking about, but maybe need that assistance because it's difficult for them to cook at home. We have two companies that we connect with that do excellent home modifications. I actually have the ability to get those occupational therapists as well to do the assessments through another company. And I think that's so important. Most important, I want to stress, is being proactive and looking ahead as to where someone's at. Again, partnering with other organizations, I think, is really important. We provide an amazing amount of services, but many of our services are also because we have a strong network of providers that we contract with as well. And those providers all are needed to work together for the individual to make sure that they can age in place. So home modifications to work on their environment, technology, fall prevention type of technology we provide. We have socialization types of technology. It's all about partnership and teamwork and working together to make sure that we get people just even durable medical equipment, assistive devices, like giving people who can afford to have a walker, wheelchair, and things that people need as they age. And the key is to pay attention and to prepare for it ahead of time. If you think you're going to need grab bars, don't get them after like you're struggling. Get them before you need them. That's the key thing. And just get all these resources to you ahead of time. I do want to mention another thing too. There is a point sometimes where someone does need to go into an assisted living. They've moved along. It's really important to pay attention and pay attention if you're caring for others to where they're at. And if they need that, that is another type of housing. We don't always put that as an innovative new type, but it is available to people who really need that extra support. So I think I covered that. That bottom line is that partnering with other agencies to make sure people get what they need and looking at all components, everything from personal care to the physical environment they're in, to the resources they need, like transportation and technology and all those other things, meals are really important. And then even one other thing I want to mention, like we have a program that partners college students with seniors who are living alone, even something like that, where you're providing that personal touch of people going into the home is also really helpful. So
Same question to you, Charlotte. I think that, you hit the nail on the head, and I think that's really the value of having this conversation today is, what are some of those nuances and what does that system of care look like for special populations when it's more than just showing up and getting and having a roof over your head. So, Pat, you first because I think yours is sort of similar, and then Linda, I really want to hear from you because your services
Yeah.
look very different than Pat and Charlotte.
Yeah, I definitely concur and echo Charlotte's points there. The technology is really a big one nowadays, and we are just adding more and more into that area. We have some individuals that use technology for medication. It helps them. It actually all but puts it in their mouth. It tells them the time it's dispensed for that day. So that's a really good one. We have someone uses technology for the lighting. They can't sleep with the lights on, but they have trouble turning them off. So we have some technology and timers for those types of things. So I think technology can really help our folks. And yeah, it's partnerships. It's really connecting with those. Volunteers are a big one for us as well. We have people, some paid supported supports, but then also some natural supports in the community and volunteers as well. And I think services are vital, but also setting people up, as we've mentioned numerous times, in the right environment. That if you're navigating in the community a lot and you're in a wheelchair, you need to be accessible to things. If you're navigating a little bit less, maybe you don't, but that initially putting that investment to set, and obviously there's not always the options that we would want, but really putting in that time and energy at the beginning to get the as perfect as we can make it environment for people to thrive, I think is really key.
Linda, how about you?
So services for us are a little bit different, but are similar in some ways in that it's a scaffolding, right? So you're trying to get people to a place where they can be sustainable, but a lot of ours is trauma related. We have a lot of trauma support because domestic violence is very psychologically embedded, right? So it takes a long time. It's one of the reasons why it takes folks 7 to 9 times to leave because it is such a psychological thing. It's not, it's kind of a layer of an onion, right? So the physical thing is that we can help them do, like we can help you get daycare services, we can help you get legal services, get divorced, get an injunction, work with the state attorney's office, work with the local police department to build a case. We do talk a lot about technology. It plays a huge role in domestic violence, both good and bad, right? Because unfortunately, just as much as technology can be used to save you, it can be used to harm you. We talk a lot about survivors with tracking devices, right? Because there's a lot of those now. There are a lot of very intricate ways in which batterers can track you on your phone. We talk a lot about how to protect yourself from when you are out in the community, right? Because you're no longer in the bubble of the shelter. You're now out in the open where you might run into your batter on the bus, right? So we talk a lot about safety planning. What if that happens? What would you do? Like, let's talk through the process of this is, you're on the bus and you see him, he shows up at your work. She shows up when you go to pick up the kids and picks a fight with you. Like, what are some of those things that you can do to keep yourself safe in the community? Where do you go? What does your support network look like, right? And I think for both Pat and Charlotte, that's a similar thing. What is a support network? Because for all of our populations, support of some kind is super important. And no one grows well alone, right? I mean, even if you're an introvert and you like to be alone, right? There's still folks around you that you would rely on if you needed to talk to someone or do something. And so that's the same thing for our supporters. But many of those times, those supporters have been connected to the batter in some way. So you may have to form new support systems. We talk a lot about how to maintain both your physical and your mental health, right? Because those components are the things that will drag you down and make it more difficult for you to get through to the next level of what you need to do. So, we do a lot of group work here because even though I say all the time, if you've met one domestic abuse survivor, you've literally met one. There are still some complexities and some things that domestic abuse survivors share that they can then talk through with someone who has been through that with them. So those type of supportive needs are really crucial for folks to get down the path. It's the physical stuff we can help with, and of course that's really helpful. But it's the psychological stuff that we have to roll back in order for you to be able to be clear-minded and be able to move forward.
Thank you for that, Linda. And I think a really great question that everyone's asking, and I know that you're all hearing it. What advice do you have for families that are looking for housing support for their loved one? And Pat, if you want to go first, and then Charlotte and Linda.
Is this a trick question? It's really a tough question, but in the world of developmental disabilities, it's about collaboration, really. It's intentional collaboration, intentional connection. We do have supported living environments and supported living supports with people with disabilities through the Medicaid waiver and through some other sectors. But I think that alignment of integration, alignment. There are some funding streams, so it's getting people educated on what the opportunities are out there, especially for developmental disabilities. There are some stipends out there for folks with developmental disabilities. But if you have a developmental disability, you have to get on the Medicaid waiver. It's just certainly a requirement. Mind you, they have a almost a 30,000 person waiting list to get on this waiver, but there are ways to get on it and ways to get ahead and get on earlier than later But I think it's some intentional collaboration, and there are supports out there. Um, there are connections. There are a lot of agencies that support people with developmental disabilities in the area of living that have connections with different organizations and different housing, um, authorities across the county. So tough question, but those are just a little tidbits there, Sandra.
Charlotte, go ahead, and then Linda.
So I think it's really important for families, caregivers, even if it's your neighbor helping you, to assess what's going on currently and potentially future needs. Also, people need to have all their paperwork in order because when you're dealing with an older adult, God forbid they get a medical incident, something happens, and they can't make their own decisions. That can be a really difficult situation. So that relates to your housing situation because if the paperwork's not in order, then someone can't help you. So making sure you have all that organized, insurance, medical, all that's really critical. If someone is watching their loved one or they themselves know that their health is getting more complex, I would call us and get a screening from us so you can get on the list for Medicaid long-term care program or CCE, ADI, one of the services that you have to be screened for. Because even if you're not at the point where you're at the top of the list and you're going to become eligible, because they get screened on a score of 1 to 5, and really you have to be a 5 to be able to start receiving services. I think it's important to get in the pipeline and get all that in there because that will actually make it so that if something does occur later on, you're already in the system and it's easier to deal with. Um, Reaching out to trusted agencies is really important because you don't have to do this alone. I think it's really important, right? So, Pat is expert in the disabilities area. So people reaching out to her for us, older adults, families reaching out to us to find out how can we assist them and really lining things up. And to me, it's about preparation. Is the place that you're living equipped to be able to have modifications as you age in place? Or do you maybe need to look at something else so that you're looking at a place where you could actually age in place there as things change? That's really, really important. So it's really about assessing what's going on, but also looking at future needs too, so that you're positioned to be in a place that's really supportive.
That's super important, Charlotte, because yeah, and especially some of our vulnerable adults, moving is traumatic. I mean, it's traumatic for all of us, but when
Yes.
you've got, some emotional issues and some physical issues and barriers, it is important to think forward, and not every people need support to think forward. It doesn't always come, you're in crisis, you're not thinking forward a lot of the time.
Exactly.
So,
And then
the
I want to mention, Pat, in reference to the population who has disabilities. Once you're 60 and above, you can also go through our long-term care screening as well. So for
okay.
your population actually, once they're 60 and above, should be going through that screening I just mentioned, right?
I
Because
actually didn't even know that. So that's great
good. Well,
information.
yeah,
Thank
so
you.
that's really important to individuals with disabilities as well. The other thing I think is a very critical piece is checking out your finances and looking at what do you have now and how does that stretch out, and looking to see, are you in a situation for your housing where it's very expensive and maybe you're spending more than you should be as far as your long-term goals go. So I think the finances is a really important piece because I mean, I began with housing in Broward is really hard because everything's so expensive here, right? So you want to look at that and see, are you aging in a place and a location that you can actually afford, that your money is going to last as well. So those are just some of the key things again, but it's around when you're dealing with seniors, looking for future planning as well, I think is really important.
I think you made sorry for interrupting, a good note about looking across, like again, me thinking, not understanding at 60, you could maybe access some different services.
Yeah,
And I think that could be the case in, many, not many, but some crossovers that we need to look at that we don't always, you look in the disability silo, you look in the aging, or you look in mental health. But I think maybe looking at those collaborations across different sectors is a good idea.
I agree. And that's why the work Sandra does is so important, right? Because she brings us together to look at the
Hmm.
different industries and to talk. I
Yes,
mean, even if you have you can have an older adult who's being abused in a relationship for years and suddenly
right.
they need some extra support. Again, we could assist them as well, right? So we can all support each other.
And we have accessibility to all, through the NEA, we have the connection. So good stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. I frequently will contact other agencies to work. For example, if I get someone who comes in who's in a crisis situation, like the older gentleman I mentioned who was in his car, I'll call over to the county and, get with their folks and let's try to get you some emergency assistance there,
Yeah.
as far as,
We had someone that was blind and we connected with them, those services, the Lighthouse for the Blind. So yeah.
yeah, I've sent people
And,
to Ellen too, and Ellen sends people to me too. So,
right. And that's across
yeah,
all areas
exactly.
of need.
Linda, same question for you. And again, definitely a different response. There's some overlap between Charlotte and Pat,
Right.
but for you, the circumstances could be very different.
Right. So when families come, families that have seen domestic violence, we encourage them to come and speak to us. And if they know they're facing some type of situation with their house, sometimes we can stop an eviction process. Sometimes we can get a mortgage caught up for you. Sometimes we can, get you to the same services, to similar services, but maybe not through us, right? The most important thing is that the housing has to be in place, because there's very few things in your life that you can do while you're living out of your vehicle, unless you really want to live out of your vehicle, right? There's lots of people that are nomads now that live out of their van and shoot, content. But that's not the kind of people we're talking about here. We're talking about people who out of necessity are now living in their cars, right? So I would encourage anyone who is trying to flee domestic violence or has fled domestic violence as a result of and needs some place to stay to please reach out to us, because we do have the ability to do both the transitional housing that we have right now, which won't be open probably until the end of January, and then additionally we do scattered site transitional housing, and we have a realtor that we work with so we can help folks. Some of the considerations are the same considerations that everyone else has, which is financial, right? So we need to talk about what your budget's going to be, because we can't have you being house poor. If your rent is completely taking up all of your money, taking up all of your paychecks, that's not going to work. If you got, and whether you're single or you have children, but if you have a family, it's super important that you have a place to lay your head, right? And children are some of the littlest victims of domestic violence, and they're one of the only groups besides pets that have zero control over their environment and what happens to them. So it's important that we provide them with a stabilization. Additionally, it's less likely if someone can leave a domestic violence relationship and flee with their children early rather than later. It's much less likely to the impact to the kids, right? Because we know that kids that are exposed to domestic violence are much more likely to either be in a domestic violence relationship later or become that unfortunate batter as a way of coping with the trauma that they experienced as a kid. So our first response is to get you the assistance you need trauma-wise, but we need to have a safe place for you to be housed. And so we work with a lot of community partners. I don't think anyone in Broward County that runs a nonprofit can run a successful nonprofit without the other nonprofits in this community. I think that one of the things, kind of giving a little bit off tangent, one of the things that's unique about Broward is that I've never worked in a community that cares more about actually doing the work than it does about fighting over the money to do the work. And I think that's a very important distinction, because I've worked in other communities where it was like sharks with blood in the water. and a lot of us share similar funding, or have similar funders, and it does not feel, from my perspective, as though there's a tug and pull. It feels very much like whatever you need for your person, whatever that person is, we're going to help you provide. And I think Broward's nonprofit community and this group and the, you know, the folks that we work with should be very proud of that fact, because it's unique, very much unique to Broward County.
I love that. Thank you so much, Linda. The next question is kind of a, a big question. We've certainly seen a lot of policy changes as it relates to housing, both at the federal level and certainly at the state level. So, Charlotte, I see you nodding your head, so we'll start with you. How have some of the recent legislative changes, either at the state level or the federal level,
Oof.
impacted the population that you serve?
I'm sorry. So, the condominium legislation that was passed by the state, I understand was meant to keep people safe of all ages because of what had happened at Surfside. So I do understand it was well intended. But unfortunately, even though it was well intended, some of the special assessments, reserve requirements, increases in insurance, all of those things have really been a major financial burden on all ages. I'm focused on older adults here because they had the added situation where they're often on fixed incomes and they had a set amount they have in their budget to pay each year, and suddenly they had these additional costs. I've participated in some forums on this, and one of the things that has been pointed out is that some of the condominium associations were maybe a bit overzealous in their implementation of the intent of the legislation. So might have included things in their assessments that maybe weren't required, or a shorter timeline. So that actually even added an additional burden on older adults. And again, this one really impacts all ages. But I think this has been a big issue for people and has cost for some people. They can't afford to live in their condominiums any longer. And that's where we've sent a bunch of people over to Coast Legal Aid, and other resources, because it's a big problem for them and they don't know what to do. So I think that legislation has caused so much distress. I know I had suggested things in some of the panels I was on, about like maybe giving no interest loans or things like that. And we had talked to the legislature about, would they potentially amend the legislation? But there's no appetite for that I heard from anyone. And that's definitely not going anywhere. So, I don't have a solution. I've discussed it a lot, been in a lot of forums about it, but I still think it's a major, major issue, particularly for our older population who lives in a lot of these condominiums. So I have a big concern about it. I would say that if we know of individuals who are really impacted by it, have them talk to Coast Legal Aid, have them talk to people who are expert on it to see if there's ways to work with their condo association and just to kind of get some relief there, because it is a really big problem on top of everything else that's going on.
Linda, I saw you nodding your head, so I'll let you answer that too.
So the recent HUD NOFO came down, well, and then it was yanked back, but it came down and it's going to come down again. So this impacts us in a huge way because it's in direct conflict with another federal law, the Violence Against Women Act. So the Violence Against Women Act says that we cannot require survivors or hold anything for their, as it relates to their housing. So I can't force you to do something in order to get housed, right? And that's a protective measure for survivors. However, the new HUD NOFO requires that everyone has to do some type of work, 40 hours of something. If you're not actively, don't hold a job, you've got to do something. So for me to use those dollars, I would have to certify and go against the Violence Against Women Act in order to get that money, which means that we can't apply for that money, right? So that's going to take a huge financial cut to domestic violence services, not just here locally, but across the nation. A lot of domestic violence programs rely on those HUD dollars in order to house their survivors and provide extra support. That money is no longer essentially available, right? Because if we do apply for it, then we're violating our standards for our FIPSA dollars. And if we don't apply for it, then we have to eat the cost of everything as it relates to housing. So, it puts us in a catch-22. We won't apply for it. I won't do anything against the Violence Against Women Act. I think that that's not in our best interest or the best interest of survivors. And I definitely don't think forcing people who are traumatized to work somewhere or, show that they're doing some type of something for 40 hours. Additionally, it takes time away from when they're trying to figure out what's going on with them, right? So, and how to really like maneuver, and how are you supposed to be out looking for a job when you're doing 40 hours of something else? So, I just think, I believe I know kind of where this is coming from, but at the end of the day, that is going to make a huge impact to housing for domestic abuse survivors.
Great.
Wow.
Linda, thank you for that. We are coming up to the top of the hour, and I don't want to keep folks longer than needed. I really wanted to thank Pat, Linda, and Charlotte for joining us today. Again, our goal was just to dive a little bit deeper into some of the nuance. And for those of you on the call to, maybe push back the next time we're having a conversation about the housing affordability crisis and people just strictly want to focus on workforce housing, to remember that we've got populations within Broward County that, again, through no fault of their own, might not be able to be reflected in the workforce full time and might not be able to rely on wages to be able to live in a home. And so, how do we provide stable housing for our most vulnerable populations that really are at the mercy of government and philanthropy and, and outside sources? I again want to thank Wells Fargo and PNC for funding our webinar series. I want to thank Harrison from Senator Nan Rich's office and Yana from the CCB. I wish everybody a safe, happy, and healthy holiday season. And please stay tuned and check us out on social media to learn more about what we will be doing in 2026 as it relates to continued education, awareness, and advocacy around the housing affordability crisis.